Cobus van Staden, it's 24th of May 2022. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to be here.
You are a man of public diplomacy and have spent a lot of time on nation branding. Now today, obviously, continent branding is a challenge, but let's start from Asia Pacific and all the way to the continent. How is brand China today on the continent, Cobus? Where is it? I mean, it's a latecomer comparing to Europe and America, but with all of the ebbs and flows and COVID, the pandemic, the debt trap diplomacy, all of that, where is China's brand today from your optics?
I think China's brand is undergoing a lot of changes in Africa at the moment. The interesting thing about China's perception in Africa is that obviously in the global north, we've seen very steep kind of declines in perceptions of China, very, very kind of negative perceptions of China, in the US, in Europe, and so on. In Africa, perceptions of China is a lot more positive. So there's these frequent kind of Afrobarometer surveys about China, about popularity of development models and external actors, development partners, and quite consistently we see that China has been scoring quite positively, like in the low 60% of approval ratings. And very similar to the United States, so that's been a kind of a long-term trend, so we've seen slight kind of declines in popularity, but I think at the moment, that to a certain extent, those numbers are a kind of a snapshot of the last 10 years, in which China has been a very active part of the infrastructure sector in Africa, and they've been a very prominent funder of things. So now, obviously, China has pulled back quite sharply from that kind of funding, and we're seeing, I expect that will probably start being reflected, in these approval ratings as we go on. I think, there's also one of the big kind of structural realities of the China-Africa relationship is that China's, obviously, as in many other places, China is very elite focused. It tends to be, to concentrate mostly on ruling parties and on senior people within those parties. So generally, kind of state responses to China are very positive, but when you look at social media and at civil society, sometimes that becomes a lot more complicated. And there, I think we've seen as civil society has become kind of more concerted in their work in Africa. In several African countries, we've seen quite negative perceptions about China emerging. And so those tend to spike, kind of in moments like, for example, in the Guangzhou incident in April of 2020, when several African residents in Guangzhou were kind of expelled from their residences because of botched COVID protocols. So at these kind of moments, these kind of public diplomacy crises, we see these kind of real spikes in kind of negative perceptions of China. But overall, I think there is a kind of it's holding steady at a kind of like mildly positive kind of perception. I think mostly because of China's massive role in terms of as being both a development partner and a funder of infrastructure.
Cobus, I've got about 1.5 million questions for you. Given your position, educated in Japan, understanding China, but also sitting in a very prosperous and influential African country as well. So you straddle so many different worlds, and being part of the South African Institute of International Affairs, again, a much respected institution in Africa. So you are in many ways an ideal guest for us. Let me follow up from Ali's initial question about, well, two follows. The first one is, do you think there is a tension between China's self-image as a developing country and the distance that it has traveled compared with really developing countries, that actually that mismatch, that the rest of the world may not see China any longer as a peer, power, but as, if you like, a superpower? That's one question. The other link to that is we hear so little about South Africa's role in the BRICS. And given the tensions that now riddle BRICS, how does South Africa manage its relations with China on the one hand, but also some of China's rivals in BRICS? For example, India.
This is a very, very interesting question. I think, like, you know, I agree with you. China is you know, straddling all these different kind of self-definitions, and you know, in some ways, if one goes to a city like Shanghai, of course, you know, kind of then the idea that China is a developing country looks crazy, you know. But when you go to other parts of China, I think it starts becoming a little bit more understandable. Like in terms of that China's process of development is a long journey, you know, kind of that it is still on, and I think, you know, so I think to a certain extent that narrative, the China's kind of position as a very powerful kind of rich country now, I think doesn't actually necessarily weaken its kind of South solidarity narrative, because its kind of own narrative of development is so central to, you know, to the relationship. So, you know, one of the biggest things beyond bridges and roads and so on that China can offer, you know, kind of a group of countries like Africa, is this narrative of development. This kind of idea that you know, kind of we used to be as poor as all of you, and now look at us. And you know, kind of with that comes you know, a set of kind of sub narratives that you know, play into some of the kind of preoccupations of African leaders themselves. So, for example, you know, as what we see in South Africa is that one of like China's real kind of core, you know, kind of attractive qualities to South African leaders is the fact that it presents a completely alternative development narrative. You know, kind of where it, you know, kind of where it's a very kind of powerful counter argument against the kind of traditional Western idea that a kind of a neoliberal Western, you know, kind of system that's based on individual rights and institutions, you know, kind of is the only path to development. So, you know, in China presents this counter narrative of a very centrally planned, state-centric, you know, development model, which chimes in lots of ways with kind of ideas of what the state is supposed to deliver, you know, that is prevalent in many African countries too. You know, kind of the state is just a bigger development actor, you know, kind of in many African countries than it is in traditional Western thinking. So in that sense, all of that kind of fits very well into this kind of idea that China is still developing, but developing at, you know, kind of at a level that no one else has been able to achieve. In relation to the BRICS, yes, it's a very interesting situation. And now that there's all of these kind of, you know, rumors of possible BRICS enlargement, I think that's going to become even a more kind of complicated situation. South Africa is, you know, as always, part of, you know, there's a joke in South Africa that, you know, kind of where they would write BRICS all in capital letters, except for the S, which is, you know, kind of like tiny at the end. You know, South Africa has always been, you know, kind of a kind of a junior partner, I think, in BRICS because, you know, because of the size of its economy in relation to the other members. And, you know, I think, you know, kind of it's difficult to kind of pull South Africa's relationship with all of the BRICS countries away from its relationship with China specifically, you know, kind of because China was quite a strong advocate for South Africa's entry into the BRICS, and its relationship with China is bigger than it is with many of the other BRICS countries. You know, so South Africa, I think, has in a lot of cases managed to kind of deal with these contradictions by not really dealing with them. You know, kind of like I think BRICS has become, as you know, BRICS kind of set to this kind of like space where these countries can interact according to rules where they kind of don't touch on the kind of heated issues between them. And particularly the tensions between India and China along their border is the key example of that, I think. And so a lot of, you know, kind of, I think, you know, kind of BRICS has become this kind of space for coordination with the proviso that certain of these kind of controversial issues shouldn't be engaged within the BRICS relationship with itself. It should be dealt with bilaterally. You know, and so it's this kind of like, kind of trying to not rock the BRICS boat, and in that sense, South Africa's, kind of abstention from votes on the Ukraine issue, for example, I kind of read as being partly, part due to that dynamic of of needing to not alienate the kind of these more powerful BRICS partners.
Very interesting. I want to take you, if possible, Cobus, to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and the milestones for 2035. Given that now, there is an object in the mirror as Build Back Better World, which is in June going to be 1 year old. Has that car left the parking? Is it catching up? Is it close? Or is it still an announcement? Is there a sense that, hey, we have to put our act together and come up with a dashboard as BRI in Africa and create our progress, have, reports even at that level at the forum with the stakeholders? Is there anything that you feel that this is going to enhance the footprint of BRI and even reinforce it as a competitor, or it's just remaining an announcement a year later? It's a very interesting issue. Like as you say, we're coming up to this 1 year anniversary. So far on the African side, we haven't seen many or any concrete kind of projects being announced. And kind of it comes also on the back of several other initiatives that all, particularly now the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, that tend to be quite kind of articulate on norm setting and kind of broad kind of parameter setting, essentially, kind of for example, like, shared values and like-minded kind of, kind of thinking among partners, and a little bit less specific in terms of actual financial commitments. And, so I think that is to a certain extent a reality with Build Back Better World as well. And compared to that, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is nothing but numbers. Kind of it's like, there's plans and goals and 10 of this, 10 of that, 9 of these, 4 of that. It's really interesting to see how kind of quantified the language is, even when you're reading the actual documents. And the kind of even now, the last FOCAC summit that took place late last year was seen in many areas as having stepped away from these kind of very large kind of financial commitments. But even so, there were still very significant and very concrete financial commitments actually being made, even though they were kind of broken down a little bit into sub-commitments. And so it's not only that is a reality of FOCAC now. It's been a reality of FOCAC for 2 decades. Kind of like very consistently each 3 years, kind of showing up, like every year these kind of diplomatic kind of rituals being repeated, and then the kind of financial commitments being honored time after time after time. So kind of it sets up this kind of track record of whether one likes it or not, just a track record of constancy. And compared to that, I think there's still a kind of a big wait and see aspect to B3W, kind of to kind of waiting and seeing what exactly it's going to be, which particular kind of fields it's going to play in, and then also, importantly for Africa, like what the kind of financial commitments will be, and within that, like whether those financial commitments will add to debt burdens or not. Have a quick follow-up, and I will just stop in a minute so Anush can come in. Is there a tactical or a strategic play, Cobus, from where you see in reduction of the financings? China has, is like brought the, what do you call, the level a notch down to demonstrate that the other camp has a long way to catch up. Is this a sort of a measured process, or is it just really China shrinking from new financing, or it's trying to send a message in its own way, in a subtle way, that don't get too excited, there is not much without us?
I think, part of this kind of pullback in financing, I think, comes is a reflection of certain kind of realities both within China and in Africa. I think even before the pandemic, there was an awareness in China that their kind of debt-fueled kind of development model, on the one hand, has a lot of potential in Africa because there's massive demand, obviously, in Africa for infrastructure. And I think in a lot of cases, African risk, even now, I think African risk in some cases is overstated. However, like kind of even before the pandemic, we also saw a very rapid increase in public debt in Africa, and several African countries kind of sliding over that line of sustainability, which then kind of started rapidly kind of worsened once the pandemic hit. So I think that kind of there's a realistic kind of gauging in China about how much debt African countries can still absorb. And how to balance that against the very large kind of demand for infrastructure that they also have. At the same time, I think in a lot of there was also kind of a lot of concern within China about economic changes within China, about the move over into a consumption economy, and political issues also, that shifted some of the logic of the go out strategy, and the kind of centrality of Chinese companies, in relation to the party. So I think all of those dynamics were in play already before the pandemic, and then got really more intensified by the pandemic. So what we're seeing now is this kind of pullback in lending is largely a pullback in policy bank lending. So from the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank, we're still seeing lending coming from other Chinese actors, and also some policy bank lending. There's a diversification of Chinese lenders in the African space, which then complicates the narrative of kind of central control. One of the complications, for example, in the Zambian debt renegotiation process has been the fact that there's 18 different Chinese lenders, involved there. So kind of this kind of, on the one hand, there is this kind of, direction setting that comes out of Beijing, but then it's a bit of a herding cat situation at the same time, kind of with all of these different kind of actors kind of moving according to their own kind of preoccupations. So, that's the reality. But at the same time, we're also seeing experiments in Africa now, and Africa is frequently this kind of space for experimentation for China, and the experiment with a lot more kind of public-private partnerships and attempts at finding other forms of financing that doesn't necessarily, increase the public debt burden, because that has proven so unpopular in Africa, but also so easy to demonize, I think, from China's kind of strategic kind of opponents. The debt trap narrative has been incredibly successful as a piece of communication, even though it's based on a lot of kind of misunderstandings. So I think there's, to a certain extent, a kind of a political kind of like rethinking of the last 10 years of financing, and I think there will probably be a return to more financing in a year or three, probably also kind of fitting into other sectors, that are now kind of emerging, I think, for China, for Chinese strategic thinking in Africa.
Cobus, I've got questions coming through, but on the last point that you've been making in response to Ali's question, so given that you have this macro perspective on things, and you mentioned COVID's impact already, how do you think is the Ukraine crisis going to affect things going forward? You mentioned the 1 to 3 year cycle. Well, this crisis economically is going to last at least that long, and unfortunately the world sees Africa as a passive actor, that the world can just come and make it better or exploit it. But we know that it's not a passive actor. African countries individually, but also collectively, have very clear interests and aspirations. when African countries get together and look at what's going on in Europe and also the great power positioning right now, how do you think it's going to play out in Africa? And then I've got my questions to ask you as well.
Yes, like Ukraine has been a very interesting situation in relation to Africa. I think, kind of when the invasion first happened and when the UN votes first happened, I think it was interesting to see how the different kind of African countries shook out. Kind of it broke down roughly at half of countries abstaining and a little bit more than half countries supporting the UN sanction of Russia. So it really, and with one country kind of fully opposing the UN sanction being Eritrea. So it showed at the same time, I think, showed how many African electorates were really appalled at the violence of the invasion, and the simple, the kind of stark kind of human rights, abuse of that entire situation. On the other hand, I think it also showed kind of the reality of the centrality of Russia to certain African economies, particularly kind of the impacts that we're now actually seeing playing out, so that I think many African policymakers were already predicting then that this is going to be bad for food prices. It's going to be hitting inflation very hard. It's, even things like cooking oil prices spiking, kind of all over the continent in direct relation to the crisis. So that I think, I think both of those kind of like reactions have been vindicated in their own kind of complicated ways. Right. But what I think what is now also emerging is that I think China has emerged as a very kind of interesting actor in all of this, because it essentially took its kind of fence-sitting position of not seeing it either kind of fully joining the Russian camp, but also not fully joining any kind of NATO kind of coalition, and turned that into a third position. It essentially, so there's so much campaigning in its diplomacy at the moment against this narrative of Western countries forcing poor countries to choose sides against their own kind of developmental instincts, or having to put their own developmental plans second in order to now kind of join this coalition, which is only focusing on Europeans. That kind of narrative has I think proven quite successful. I think it's gotten quite a lot of sympathy in Africa. So in that sense, I think what I'm seeing, kind of developing is on the one hand, like a real, very serious economic impact, kind of coming from this, that I think is starting to completely kind of, dominate the continent's discussion of the Ukraine issue beyond any of the other kind of complications of the situation. But then also increasingly this kind of, an interesting position where China is essentially using rhetoric that, kind of an anti-polarization rhetoric as part of a polarization play, kind of where it's essentially kind of like gaining all this political influence, kind of, or political kind of like messaging against kind of the Western bloc in the name of, kind of like decrying polarization and pressure on countries to choose sides. So, so it's an interesting kind of like emerging diplomatic position.
Right. Cobus, so you've used the phrase private-public partnership, which is where I was initially wanting to take you to. PPPs, credited, discredited, went back to, ignored, and so on, but it seems to be in vogue again. I'm assuming for the moment that the Ukraine crisis and aftermath will enhance geoeconomic competition globally, and that it will put severe pressure on all sorts of chains, no matter what sort that you want to look at. If that assumption is correct, then PPE becomes really significant in many ways, because going back to place where you're educated, in Japan, University of Nagoya, for example, Japan, of course, has this free and open initiative. It works with India, in Africa in particular, but there is no disguising that it is a competition for BRI. Now, while our program is called BRI Dialogues, we're also mindful of BRI parallels that are out there too. And so Europeans have got their own global gateway, which also talks about PPP and so on. But we don't seem to focus enough about Japan's geoeconomic diplomacy, not just in Asia, but particularly in Africa. So given that US President Joe Biden is in that region right now, given that he has been hosted by his Japanese counterparts, and given that the so-called Quad is now sailing ahead on so many levels, Japan is a pivotal actor in that regard. So how do Japanese square this circle of balancing China while staying close to the United States militarily and for security reasons, but also managing the geoeconomic competition through their own free and open initiative? And do you see much evidence of that in Africa in particular? I'm sorry, I'm loading a huge amount on you, but you are so well placed and you're such an important observer and expert in this that we cannot afford not to have your views aired here.
So thank you. Yes, I think, you know, Japan in Africa is such an intriguing situation, actually, because, you know, Japan has been a long-term partner to Africa. It's a very large kind of development partner and infrastructure partner. And because they frequently, they frequently keep things on a kind of a much more kind of kind of quiet basis. Kind of they're not as kind of promoting of these kind of initiatives as China is. So one tends to sometimes forget how active Japan has actually been in Africa and how what a big partner they are to many African countries. So it's a really interesting situation. I think in some respects, like. I think Japan kind of sees both the need to compete with China and the need to cooperate with China, or to keep kind of friendly relations with China. And there, I think its version of the free and open Indo-Pacific differs somewhat from that of the United States. Because Japan, when one speaks to Japanese stakeholders, they always really emphasize, kind of the cooperative nature of all of these things, and kind of they tend to steer very kind of say far away from any kind of language of containment, and so in the process, I think what I've also seen over the kind of last few years has been that Japan takes quite a lot of lessons from China, kind of in Africa. I think they're actively engaged with what China's doing, and they tweak their own approaches, kind of to also reflect that. So over the last 20 years or so, we've seen Japan move away from an almost 100% kind of aid-focused approach to an approach that's a lot more interested in commerce and trade and manufacturing, and I think a lot of that has and Japan is not alone there, but a lot of that has been looking at successes that China has achieved in Africa and seeing like, oh, I think China is to a certain extent kind of defamiliarized, or like actually familiarized Africa in lots of ways to people, or defamiliarized, kind of the standard approaches to Africa, and kind of threw open a lot more options. So even other kind of actors like Turkey, like the United Arab Emirates, for example, like South Korea, I think took kind of lessons from China in kind of in being like, oh, you could actually just do a commercial project in Africa. It doesn't have to be an aid project. You can simply build a road and get paid for that and deliver it on time, and kind of not kind of get eaten by rhinos, or kind of so it's kind of like simply positioned Africa as just another place to do business, which I think kind of Africa used to be very siloed in terms of the discourse about it, and so so Japan, I think, is it's very interesting to go to TICAD, for example, the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, like which is their version of FOCAC, which actually predates FOCAC. And in a lot of ways, it's quite similar to to FOCAC discourse in terms of in terms of being very development focused, very kind of like pulling in both the state and development agencies and companies. But where it's different is that it's also very kind of multilateral, very open. So one would kind of go to TCAD and see exhibitions on German development initiatives and how they cooperated with Japan, for example, or like Turco-Japanese kind of initiatives and so on, which you don't tend to see in FOCAC, because FOCAC tends to be so China focused. So in that sense, I think it's both learning from China, even as China was obviously learning from Japan, and some of these kind of tools that China tried out in Africa as a development partner, particularly, for example, resource-backed loans, started off actually being engineered by Japan in China, and so it's this kind of interesting kind of like peer learning and then peer learning again, kind of as they kind of like experiment with different approaches in Africa.
Like reverse osmosis in more ways than one.
Exactly, yes.
So I want to take the question back to the latest crisis. Sadly, we go from one to the other, and what Anush touched on rightly so. Between 2018 to 2020, roughly 44% of the wheat to Africa came from Russia and Ukraine. Is there a continental pressure behind the doors as a track to diplomacy, talking to Washington, talking to Moscow, talking to Kiev, that, hey guys, this is disaster for the continent, and you have a geopolitical crisis, but if this continues, get prepared for poverty, for famine, and for migration northbound? That was one question. The second one, I want to just weave into the economic pattern. Oil and gas, again, is back on the agenda. Larry Fink and BlackRock are saying they're not going to pass any new resolutions against oil and gas and shareholders, etc. Does this give more significance to some of the oil-producing countries and oil and gas, like, Manazi Bay in Tanzania or Angola, for attracting more foreign direct investment in that sector from China, in your opinion?
In relation to the track 2 diplomacy and Ukraine, I've seen some limited attempts. So, for example, South Africa has been was particularly early on in the crisis, was was trying to position itself as a possible mediator, and was trying to through its extension from the UN vote, was trying to position language, like a different set of language, around kind of some form of reconciliation process, possibly, between Ukraine and Russia. I think now, we're seeing, to a certain extent, we're seeing the disempowered position that Africa occupies in the world. That there are, even as these crises are hitting, Africa in a very concrete way. I think many countries aren't particularly interested in hearing what Africa has to say about those. And I think I agree with you that I think we're seeing the makings of a possible future migration crisis, particularly as these kind of issues overlap with climate disruption and with other related issues, like, for example, we're seeing the collapse of fishing economies all along the west coast of Africa, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea, not least due to industrial fishing, which used to be driven very sharply by Europe, but is currently driven very hard by China. So all of these factors, only some of them have direct bearing on Ukraine, but a lot of them are I think Ukrainian issues are going to be working with them to create a kind of a set of circumstances that's going to, I think, cause tension. I think Europe's relationship with Africa has become so dominated by the migration issue that it's I think there's this kind of limited kind of space for maneuvering, I think, on both sides, actually, so if there is a renewed migration issue, then I think there would have to be some new form of some other form of diplomacy or cooperation will have to be worked out between them, kind of because we're seeing like, kind of a situation in some countries where I think governments are going to start losing control over, kind of, or they're running out of options, kind of to stop that kind of crisis from developing. In relation to oil, yes, definitely. I think kind of we're seeing increased interest in oil and gas all around the continent. There's been a lot of oil and gas finds all along the east coast of Africa, so that's definitely I saw actually in relation to Japan, I saw proposals that Japan is apparently interested in developing, in kind of retrofitting kind of gas storage ships in order to kind of also make them refining hubs, and then kind of essentially parking them off the coast of Mozambique and other East African countries, and that is only kind of, that's emerging over the last few months, in reaction to the Ukraine crisis. So within Africa, there's a lot of discussion about which particular form the green transition in Africa should take. Right. And because Africa is such a small part of, such a really minuscule part of global emissions came from Africa, there's a lot of pressure for allocations to be made for African countries to use particularly natural gas in their own kind of transition to, kind of in their own development processes, and their own, as a kind of a middle step towards a fully kind of like renewable kind of transition. We saw a lot of resistance coming, against that from the global north, at places like, at the last COP, for example. And this, I think, the current Ukrainian situation is both of suddenly now everyone is interested in gas and oil again, kind of, but I think that's, it's both kind of suddenly flushing a lot of money into those sectors that didn't seem to be, kind of like that promising even a year ago. And at the same time, I think holding back discussions about green transitions in places where they should happen. So for example, I thought for a long time, and I think there's many African kind of, commentators who made the same point, that in essence, Africa should actually be the only kind of region in the world, or then Africa and the rest of the global south should be the only people who should be allowed to use natural gas as a transition technology, and the global north should already be on renewables, kind of like considering the amount of the kind of development legacy, their own kind of emissions legacy, the amount of money, kind of in those countries. And that discussion is kind of being derailed now, I think, kind of by the Ukraine crisis. So suddenly, for example, we have, like 2 or 3 months ago, like Anthony Blinken kind of visiting Algeria, for example, in order to kind of facilitate kind of gas, provision to Europe, for example, and so on. So, so I think it's raising a lot of debate, in Africa, but I think a lot of that debate is also only within Africa, because I think a lot of that is just simply not being picked up in the rest of the world.
It's fascinating what you're intimating, Cobus, and that is that while Ukraine crisis is heralding in a very kind of insecure prospects for the continent, at the same time, oil and gas are providing a boon for their economies,
yes,
which makes
possibly,
it very difficult to justify this notion of African exceptionalism in that regard. But
yes,
there is obviously money coming in the coffers of several African countries. In East Africa, Ali's mentioned Angola, but of course in North Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco to an extent as well. So do you see these unexpected resources cushion African economies from the bigger hit that is coming in? That's one question. The other is, while we look at the food insecurity dimension of the Ukraine crisis, in Africa in particular, of course, particularly North Africa, there is, of course, the political insecurity dimension as well. Do you see a direct link between lack of access to basic foodstuffs, and regimes, political leaders being able to maintain stability? I know two probably related questions for you.
Yes, definitely. In terms of whether these revenues are cushioning these economies, I think, I think it's, kind of, we'll only really know, I think, in a few months, to see how it really shakes out. The reason I'm a little hesitant is because for a lot of these countries, there are deposits, but in some cases these deposits haven't been explored yet, or they are, they have been explored, but the kind of links to the ports, the roads, the rail connections, and so on that make them easily exportable are in process. There's for example, Nigeria is looking around for money at the moment to fund a big oil pipeline, it's one of those things where if that obviously is, kind of this kind of situation where if the pipeline had already been up, then this would have been a very profitable moment for them. But at the moment, they're looking for funding for it at a moment where they're already very overstretched. So I think that's true for many, kind of for many African countries, and you're seeing a lot of kind of this port will be ready in 2023. This kind of road is target of 2025. Those kind of situations. I think that kind of mitigate against the kind of an easy assumption that they're necessarily making a lot of money from it right now. But I think certainly kind of now that there's all of this interest, I think some African countries definitely do seem like they may well be getting some kind of windfall from it, and at the same time they're also in response kind of rapidly kind of redirecting kind of earlier development plans. So it'll be interesting to see what the kind of long-term development impact is on these countries. In relation to food and politics, yes, I think there's definitely a danger there. Like we already saw before that, that earlier food price spikes, kind of like in reaction to the global economic crisis, for example, had a direct bearing on kind of on political instability, particularly in North Africa. And I think in the fact that this is coming on the back of disruptions from the pandemic, I think just kind of adds to that. So I do think that we probably will see political instability not only in North Africa but probably in other parts of Africa as well.
Ali's poised to come in. I should say that it was remiss of me not to mention Libya, of course, which is a fragmented state, but sits at the heart of huge reserves, yes. And seems to be kind of falling to pieces while the world needs its resources. But thank you, Cobus. Ali's poised.
But just picking on that one, that was another folly of another invasion and aggression, which has left almost a failed state, as Anu said. But today with you, Cobus, it's like being in a gelato shop and, Africa being there, and Anoush and I have been tasting one spoon from each subject, and it's with 54 flavors in that continent, all unique in their own way. We'd love to have you back. But I normally bring our sessions to an end with two standard and fixed questions to our guests and wizards like yourself. What is your single piece of advice from an African continent point of view to the xenophobes, if you were to leave them with one piece of advice? And what is the single piece of advice for xenophiles from where you are sitting?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think, to a certain extent, I think the advice to them is kind of the same advice, which is that like Deborah Brautigam, kind of the very prominent kind of expert on China-Africa relations and particularly Chinese lending to Africa, she uses the analogy of the old story of the blind kind of group of experts on the elephant, kind of where each of these experts were kind of touching a different part of the elephant and then coming up with a different idea of what that animal looks like. So someone would be touching the trunk and like talking about its sinuous and snake-like nature, kind of another one would be touching the tail and talking about its bristly nature. To a certain extent, the China-Africa relationship is so complex and so huge that you can talk it positively or you could talk it negatively. You know, kind of you could make a very concrete case that China is the best thing that's ever happened to Africa, and you can make a very concrete case that China is the worst thing that ever happened to Africa. And like you can, and all of both of those cases would be based on solid data, you know, solid anecdotal evidence, you know, like, so in that sense, you know, kind of what I find fascinating about the relationship is that it tends to kind of reveal itself in this very kind of complex way, and then in the process kind of reveal one's own frame of reference to oneself, you know. And in that sense, I tend to think of it as very interesting, particularly in relation to the West's relationship with Africa, because it tends to be quite revealing of, you know, of different kind of dynamics in that relationship. I think in terms of advice, I would, I think that both for cinephiles and sinophobes, I think the main advice, I think, is to try and stay away from thinking of Africa as a unified actor and to step away from China as a unified actor, because one of the lessons from the China-Africa relationship is exactly this kind of complicated dynamic in China between general direction setting that comes from the top and then a quite chaotic kind of, you know, different set, like massive set of different actors kind of jumping into formation in their own complicated ways, you know. And on the African side, you know, kind of the you know, I think it's important to always complicate the number of actors involved, but also the positionality of those different actors in relation to external power. You know, because we tend to have such kind of a strong, for good reasons, very strong kind of historical narrative of stark victimization in Africa, you know, kind of by external actors. And, you know, Africa is still dealing with that legacy, and it will be dealing with that legacy for a long time. But because of that, of that kind of strong historical narrative, I think it really is important to unpack the particular kind of different actors involved in the African relationship, because they're not all victims and they're not all weak. And a lot of them have quite a lot of power and quite a lot of money, you know, and the interactions between them and various Chinese, you know, kind of actors, entities of different stripes, make for this incredibly complicated relationship that you know, kind of that happens at both the kind of like supranational kind of like, you know, kind of like multilateral level, all the way down to kind of individual labor relations in very small African towns. And, you know, so in that sense, like it's the thing with the China-Africa relationship is you think it's complex, and then you kind of open it up, and then it just falls into several more layers of complexity, you know, kind of once you start looking at it, you know. So this is always more complexity on top of more complexity. And that, you know, that is, I think, is a kind of a cautionary aspect for both sinophiles and sinophobes, I think.
Absolutely fascinating. And that's the reason why we need you back again, Cobus, because I think we've only just opened one layer. We've got several layers to go through. Ali often talks about this in terms of an onion. I think this is definitely a large onion that we need to peel away at. The Institute is very lucky to have you, Cobus, because your command of your subject matter, but also ability to articulate and respond to our questions is outstanding. And it's extraordinary that we are in the same timeline, but sitting in very different worlds, but talking about things that will affect all of our lives. And your responses, your articulation of the issues has been extraordinary. So we are privileged to have had you. I have followed your writings as well as your utterances and so on for some time. So it's a real pleasure to see you in person, but also to have you to speak to us and educate us in a way that you have done. It's great that you have also responded so fully to Ali's question regarding the perspectives on China, particularly from the African continent, as you say, has got so many layers and so many complicated elements. If we're talking about African-European relations, I was reminded of what they teach at schools here, that it takes a very long time to recover from bullying. And I suspect in that regard, for most of Africa, that you know, the hangover from the bullying is going to take a very long time, and that is probably one of the different glosses that shapes African-Chinese relations, because they can both talk about being bullied, and China can come in with a very different set of propositions, even though not all of it may be palatable. So
Yes.
you've been extraordinary, Cobus. I must thank you warmly, and also to say that we would love to have you back again as dramas in Africa and elsewhere unfold.
Thank
Absolutely.
you very much.
Thanks so much. I'd love to join you again. It's so fun to speak with both of you. It's fantastic. Thank you.